pump up the volume, I guess. So I wanted to start by, I guess, talking about the Gomeroi Guyangal logo, which you can see here on the left-hand side. This was an artwork we spent, when we first established our work, we decided to spend a long time in consultation with the Indigenous community, because we know that many Indigenous communities are very distrustful of doing this kind of research. So we spent 2 years in community consultation, and part of that 2 years actually helped us develop a logo. So the logo was developed by a beautiful Indigenous artist called Georgina Altona, and I'll just talk you through. A lot of Indigenous artwork has a story behind it, and I think it's very similar to what we see in some parts of Canada as well. So you can see it's a circle, and inside the circle you can see the shape of a woman who's pregnant, and she's standing with her arms crossed across her shoulders like this, and that shows from the Indigenous perspective that she's ready for motherhood and ready to embrace all that motherhood begins. When you see the artwork, because it's quite big, you can actually see inside the belly of the mother tiny little white dots, all in the shape and sort of curved the way we would see the curvature of a spine of an infant in utero. And that means that the ancestors' spirits are also sitting within the infant. So anything in Indigenous artworks in Australia that has white dots means that the Indigenous spirits are involved. So you can see the Indigenous spirits are involved, completely embracing this whole image. And the other thing you can also see is the teardrop shape that the mother figure is sitting inside. So that teardrop shape represents tears of both joys and sorrows, because motherhood can bring both happiness and sorrow, as we know. There's often losses, there's grief, but there's also incredible joy that goes with motherhood that can bring tears to the eyes. Surrounding the teardrop shape, you can see these are actually follicles, and so we had a lot of discussion with the artist doing this about reproduction, and that this was a reproductive study and reproductive potential. And so what she's shown there is follicles. They're all different colours, because some follicles are just lost with menstruation with a woman, but others of those actually go on to become an infant that will go on to live a long and healthy life, and that was what we ultimately are all after. So that's the Gomeroi Guyangal logo, which I always like to share when I've got the time to do it, because it's such a beautiful story. Gomeroi Guyangal actually means babies from Gomeroi lands. So I'll take you through and you'll get to see what I'm talking about. Before I talk too much more, I'd like to acknowledge this is a very traditional practice in Australia, so I would like to acknowledge the traditional elders on the land in which we stand, and I would like to acknowledge the future generations that are coming through and everything that they bring to the land. I would also like to acknowledge the elders on the land in which I work. So in Tamworth, I work with the Gomeroi people. In Walgett, I work with the Kamilaroi people. And in Newcastle, we work with the Awabakal people. And you can see there's vastly different landscapes of those lands, and I'm very, very lucky and privileged that I get to work in all of those. So Kirsty and Samantha, who are sitting here at the front of the room, they're based in Newcastle, and I'm based in Tamworth, but I tend to go between the 3 different sites. I thought I'd give you a bit of a run through of what I'm going to talk about today, because there's quite a few things I want to talk about. So we're going to discuss Australia's geography and history, just to put things in a bit of context for you, some background on the health of Indigenous Australians and what's known in the current literature, the aims and methods of our Gomeroi Guyangal cohort, some of the findings of the cohort, and I'm going to specifically talk about obesity, nutrition and the impact of those on renal health, as well as mental health in pregnancy, because I know that your team here are very interested in stress, so I thought I would spend some time with that. And then I would look at some of the innovative approaches that we're using Arts Health, so you can see some of the artworks that Belinda's been talking about. So this is the landscape. This is fairly close to my house. I'm very lucky. I live in rural Australia. And so, yeah, this is a fairly typical afternoon, winter or summer. It looks like this. It's just the temperature varies pretty markedly. Not as much as you guys, though. This map of Australia is actually broken up into the tribal groups of the Indigenous people of the country. And you'll see there's a green arrow, and outlined in green, not all that well, I have to say, is the Kamilaroi Nation, which is where, and Awabakal Nations, which is where we base our studies. So we're in the New South Wales state, which I guess is similar to your provinces, which is on the east coast of Australia. Some past history of Australia. We have, like Canada, we have had some terrible things happen to the Indigenous people of the country. So we do need to talk about that to put some of the things that we're going to talk about in context. The people of the country, when the country was first settled, were primarily nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and the country was once inhabited solely by Aboriginal people. There's been findings recently that they actually have ceremonial evidence that was of ceremonies occurring with the Indigenous people, particularly around burial, from 60,000 years ago. So we know that the people have been in the country for many, many, many generations. We were colonised by the English, and at that time there was a lot of things that happened to the Indigenous Australians that we are still feeling the ripples of, and the people will feel the ripples of for very many years, I believe. This artwork I did want to talk about. This was actually painted by one of the staff members at my work, so I'm very privileged. I work with a team of all Indigenous women, but this is one of her artworks. So I just wanted to, I've got artworks all the way through, so I'll explain them as I go along. The Europeans took over traditional lands, and at the time that they did, many of the Indigenous people were lost, mostly a lot through infection, because they obviously had no infective protection against things like smallpox and measles. Those kind of things just eradicated huge numbers of people. But also there was a huge amount of massacres within the lands, and certainly in the Tamworth region there was a very large and significant massacre in that area. So there's enormous trauma. In the early 20th century, there were laws passed to separate the Indigenous people from and protect them, I guess is the term that they used. And particularly what they did was, if children were slightly lighter coloured, then they were particularly removed from their families. This has since become known as the stolen generation. And these children were moved to missions, and I know that in Canada you've had a lot of things happen with residential schools. The aim of going on to missions was not to educate the children. In fact, they were virtually going to shifted to mission stations, and this was really about containing them and removing all their cultural practices. So the missions are very, very small. There's a number of missions that are still around today. In Walgett, the community we go to, there's 2 mission stations there, and you can certainly see how the loss of traditional practices such as hunting and gathering were completely lost because they were literally fenced in. So following this period, we came to what is known as the stolen generation, and this was very definitely about removing what they would call at that time half-caste children. I've put this image here, and it's probably a bit hard for you to read right down at the end. But what it actually says, so I've got to squint at the screen as well. This was an ad for children, basically Indigenous children that they were trying to find homes for lots of different reasons. So I like the little girl in the centre of the group, but if taken by someone else, any of the others will do, so long as they are strong. And when you look at these tiny children, somebody's looking at them basically to be a house servant or something on the farm. The stolen generation was still going on at the time of my birth, which I don't look, well, I like to think I don't look that old, but it's still, this was still in our absolute recent history. The right to vote only came into the 70s, and in the early 70s of Australia, Aboriginal people were actually on the flora and fauna laws rather than the human laws, and so they only came into our national census and were counted as part of the human population in the 70s. So you can imagine those kind of traumas that were inflicted on the people. In 2007, our Prime Minister at the time, Kevin Rudd, this is probably one of the things he's most famous for in his time. He formally apologised to the Indigenous people of Australia, and he did that in Parliament. It was an extremely significant day for Aboriginal people, and a very, very emotional day, and still is an emotional day. Indigenous people now in Australia it's called Sorry Day. That's considered to be a public holiday, and they can go and spend time and do cultural events to celebrate the fact that they were recognised. Somebody recognised that this was an atrocity committed to them. At around the same time, the Close the Gap campaign was developed, and that was to improve health of Indigenous Australians. So what we know about the health of Indigenous Australians is generally that there's a huge trust of health services because when they were in missions and things, many of the Indigenous people were experimented on, particularly I know there were treatments around, they were infected with syphilis and then tried a whole lot of different treatments on them. And I know that this isn't unusual for Indigenous populations globally, but it was certainly, you know, we're still feeling this, you know, and the people are. Many Indigenous Australians live in very remote and rural areas, which is similar to Canada, I guess, because you guys are such an enormous country as well. So the service provisions aren't great. So if you are an unwell Indigenous Australian, you may not actually be able to get access to healthcare without moving significant distances. And in medical services, culture is rarely taken into account. So what actually is the burden of health for Indigenous Australians? We know that there's increased rates of malnutrition, high rates of anemia, extremely high rates of diabetes and renal disease, high rates of hypertensive disorders, high rates of obesity, and increased rates of cardiovascular disease, all of which we're trying to find answers to using a developmental origins of health and disease approach. So what about pregnancy? What happens in terms of reproductive health? Reproductive health is an interesting one because there's very little in the literature about Indigenous Australians and about what they see as important, but we're currently doing work around this at the moment. But what we do know is that women are less likely to plan a pregnancy, they're younger for their first pregnancy, they have much higher risks of a sexually transmitted infection, they have much larger families, they're less likely to attend regular antenatal services, but as I said, many of these women live in very remote areas of Australia, and so there actually isn't antenatal services there for them to access. And much later in their pregnancy to have their first antenatal visit, but that again often relates to how far they are from a service access point. This is some probably slightly old data, but the newer data isn't any different really. What we see for Indigenous Australians is their actual outcomes in terms of pregnancy are significantly worse than non-Indigenous Australians. And this holds true no matter what geographical region you go to in Australia, no matter what the socio-economic state, no matter what the educational level of the women is. So basically preterm delivery is approximately double, low birth weight, double, fetal death, neonatal death and perinatal death all occur at roughly double the rates. So what was the aim of our Gomeroi-Guyangal program? So we set this cohort up about 10 years ago, I guess it's been going. Does that sound right, Kirsty? And particularly, we wanted to understand the developmental origins of health and disease because there certainly are some Indigenous Australians that go on to have extremely long, healthy, beautiful lives. But on the whole, we're seeing that the life expectancy is markedly shorter than non-Indigenous Australians. And at this stage, I think it's sitting at about 17.9 years difference in life expectancy. In particular, we wanted to focus on renal disease. When I did my community consultation in the communities, I'd never spent much time with Indigenous Australians prior to that. And in that time, what I learned, every single Indigenous person I met and we're talking to about what were the health issues that they were worried about and they were concerned about, kept talking about renal disease. And every person knew somebody that was affected by renal disease, which, as you know, renal disease doesn't really have symptoms until you're at the point of needing dialysis. And then in needing dialysis, you have to move somewhere to where there's a dialysis unit, which is often very challenging for families to manage. We also are very interested in developing interventions. Of course, we want to be able to change the health projections for these communities and making sure that those interventions are culturally sensitive and happening at the right time in life for people. Oops. So the cohort that we have, it's a longitudinal cohort. It's from pregnancy right through until early childhood. We see women as early as they identify themselves in antenatal clinics, and from there they are seen right through until the kids are 5 years of age, and we're in the process of getting ethics to extend that through to the kids at 10 years of age. At the moment, the cohort is sitting at 382 women from pregnancy, and we are continuing to recruit in that. And in the follow-up, we've so far seen 151 of the women, which is about a retention of about 40%, which is extremely hard to retain women in these cohorts because the communities are very, very mobile. But so far we've had about 317 visits undertaken by each DIHAD, sorry, not undertaken by each DIHAD, but undertaken overall in the postpartum area. So how do we do that? obviously is a challenge for, I think, any cohort study. All of our team are Indigenous, so Indigenous research staff spend time doing the recruitment and retention, and they make sure that the family is very heavily involved in that decision, talking with their aunties, husbands, partners, however they do it, to make sure that the whole family supports this involvement in this study, because it is a demanding study for the women. There is a lot that they have to do, so it's very good to make sure that we get the whole family on board in that process. Obviously, persistence is extremely essential. We do a lot using social media these days to retain our women in our cohort, and that's been an interesting thing. We virtually had no retention postpartum, didn't we, Kirsty, until we went to social media. A lot of the women, their use of their mobile phone changes all the time, so they lose their phone, they change their number, the phone gets given to somebody else, so we would often lose their contact details, whereas social media, they tend to retain their Facebook accounts, and Facebook is often free with your service provider, so that actually meant that the women could contact you, whereas with a mobile number they often couldn't. We take 3 contact numbers, and usually that's mum, herself, her partner and her mother or auntie, and that's worked really, really well, because obviously the phone thing, everybody's changing numbers all the time. We try and do a convenient location. That can be that we do home visits, which is often challenging, because doing a home visit, it might be that mum has 13 children, and it might be that there's multiple families living in the one house. So doing a home visit can take hours and hours and hours, because you have to see everybody and you have to chat to everybody. So instead of going to do a research visit to take an hour, it may take 4. But that's just how we have to roll with it, I guess. We do a lot of partnering with other organisations where we can, because there's lots of other organisations. So for us, Medicare Local and the Aboriginal Medical Services are all there to provide certain supports to the women in the cohort. So if we can partner with them, it may be that they've got another appointment with the Aboriginal Medical Service, and we try and tie it together so it's less demanding for the mum to have to do both appointments on different days. We try and do them on the same day, that kind of thing, because they do have big families and they've got lots of toddlers often, so it can be really challenging. I know going out with my kids when they were toddlers was an absolute nightmare, and I've only got 2, so if you've got 13, it becomes really hard to do. So this is some of our staff in our study. Loretta, you can see in the centre there doing some aliquoting. Loretta is primarily our recruitment and retention guru. We could not do anything without her, and she often does a lot more in the art space these days as well. Up the top is Megan. Megan's taking some blood samples there, and Megan's actually gone off on maternity leave and probably won't come back. She's went off to have one baby and then fell pregnant with twins, I think 8 months later. So I don't know that Megan will get back because she's a bit too busy these days. We take 3 samples in pregnancy. We try and do it in each trimester, but really we do opportunistic sampling across this cohort. It does make some of our data analysis challenging, but we have to do that because sometimes culturally women just can't get there when they're meant to get there. It can be that there's a funeral on, which they call sorry business, those kind of things. So we have to be really flexible for that. We do an ultrasound, and we're looking at the fetal growth and development in that ultrasound, particularly looking at the renal growth of the child. We do lots of surveys, so surveys about smoking exposure, racism and discrimination, as well as psychosocial surveys, and I'll talk a bit more about those in a little while. Recently, we added nutrition surveys. For some reason, we didn't think to do them right at the start, but in the last 12 months, we've now, 12 months? Yeah, maybe 2 years. Yeah, we've added nutrition surveys in pregnancy, so we're doing those as well. Mums give us their weight and blood pressure, and then when baby's born, we get the cord blood, and we also get a 24-hour urine from the baby as well. And that helps us give a non-invasive measure of renal function of the child at delivery, which is great. Loretta loves the babies, and one of her jobs is that she goes and collects the cord blood, and her reason that she wants to do that, she won't let anybody take that job off her, because it means she gets to go and play with the baby first before anybody else. So even if it's 2 or 3 in the morning, she doesn't mind. She goes and collects the cord blood and chats to the baby at the first time, and she considers herself an auntie to all of the babies in our cohort, and she loves being first there to share the breath, is what it's called. So both the mother and child are in our follow-up. We get detailed diet history from mum and baby, because we know that nutrition is one of the most modifiable things that we can do in terms of reducing cardiovascular and renal disease. So that's why we're really doing a lot around nutrition. We do a lot of anthropometry, so looking at how the baby's growing, particularly looking at obesity and development. Maternal weight, we're looking at the same, because we know that we have quite a lot of obesity in our women, but we want to see if they're losing their pregnancy weight and seeing how they're going. Detailed medical history, and we take blood and urine samples. Interestingly, we have ethics permission to take blood samples from the infants as well, but none of the mothers will give us permission for that. So we do have blood and urine samples from the mums, but at the moment we only have urine samples from the infants. We are going to actually in the next 12 or 13 months do an education program with some of our mums, particularly where we've identified that a mum has significant renal issues herself, that it's really important that we actually get a blood sample from the child as well, so we can monitor how their kidneys are going much better. But that will involve quite a significant education program with the mums, because to all intents and purposes to them, the baby's healthy and well. It doesn't seem like they should be needing to share blood. So,
can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
What causes this high incidence of renal problems?
We don't know. We really don't know. So Kirsty can probably answer some questions around the renin-angiotensin system. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I think and that's really why we focused on kidney disease in pregnancy, because we know that Indigenous Australians are born with fewer nephrons than non-Indigenous Australians, and we think in population, we think it's got to do with the high rates of preterm birth and growth restriction in pregnancy. So if you're born earlier, because the kidney development occurs in that later stage of pregnancy, if you're born earlier, you don't have the opportunity to grow as many nephrons, and we think that puts them at risk of developing kidney disease later on. So this is sort of cycle, but also kidney disease in the mum affects fetal kidney development as well. So this is sort of perpetuating cycle of
certainly there's been
kidney growth and then kidney disease.
And there's certainly been animal studies that have shown that if mum has kidney disease, then the infant takes on some of that renal function during pregnancy and damages their own kidneys. So I think it's kind of the two things working in parallel. It's huge, the levels of kidney disease. So what do we know about our cohort? Like, what's our starting point? We know that 61% of our mums are obese and overweight before their pregnancy starts, with a BMI of about 33. Now, when you look at the 10 most obese countries in the world, and this is probably not as up to date as it could be, Australia's number 3. So that's not really surprising that we're seeing that level of obesity in the mothers. We started looking at what actually happened then to those women across pregnancy, because we wanted to know if they're starting pregnancy obese, are they then gaining huge amounts of weight that then obviously has implications for the infant as well as the mum longer term. So the dotted line is, so gaining weight during gestation is related to your BMI. So you have to gain according to the BMI level that you are. So the dotted line indicates what you're supposed to gain, and the red line indicates what our cohort is gaining. So you can see in our underweight women, so this is those with a low BMI, they're gaining slightly more than they should, and that sort of starts to kick in at about 30 weeks of gestation. With our normal weight mums, we see much the same. They are gaining more weight than they should, but it's actually starting much earlier in pregnancy. So you can see it's starting from about halfway of pregnancy at 20 weeks, we're starting to see they're gaining more than they should, so that trajectory is increasing. When we look at our overweight mums, they're actually gaining significant amounts more than they should be doing, which made me very, very worried when I was thinking about, okay, well, what about the obese women? Because I know we've got a lot of obese women in this group. But when we look at the obese categories, and these are classified into 3 different classifications of weight gain, when I looked at this, they actually are gaining pretty much what they should, which I was really surprised at. I think we really were. So this has been useful for us to start thinking about what we need to do in terms of developing interventions to relate to gestational weight gain for pregnancy. But when we looked at whether it was who was gaining the most, like how many of the cohort were actually gaining exactly what we saw, what they should, only 14% of the cohort are gaining what they should be. Everybody else is either inadequate weight gain or excessive weight gain, which really indicates that no matter what BMI they're starting with, the whole cohort needs further education about what is the appropriate weight gain in pregnancy that should be happening, whether it's more or less than what they're currently gaining. So that's something that we're working towards in the next 12 to 18 months, I think. Now, not everything is easy. Like as I said earlier, we don't always do things the way we should. This is Juanita, and she really hates being weighed on the scales because they're cold on her bottom, and every time you put her on there, she gets very, very upset. But what I was going to say about Juanita there was, this was, I guess, really where we started to go, oh, hang on, why didn't we ask about weight, like nutrition in pregnancy? We did that too late. However, we have got a reasonable number. So I'm going to talk a bit about the nutrition and what we're seeing in the mums. We do, in first trimester, we do a 24-hour recall, and that looks at all of the food and intake that's been happening in that 24 hours. And then in third trimester, we do a food frequency survey, and that's called the AES, which is the Australian Eating Survey. And it's a very long survey, and it looks at the previous 6 months. So between those 2 time points, we actually end up with a fairly good nutritional profile for their entire pregnancy, which is great. We've looked at the outcomes for the nutritional intake according to the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. Now, I'm sure you guys would have a similar model to this. We call this in Australia the plate model. So it's this is the health promotion poster that we see in almost every doctor's surgery around the country about this is roughly the foods you should be eating and the quantities on your plate of each of these servings. When we analysed our group just recently, you can see it's only a small number of women. It's about 58 women. We had to pull out some of the women who had twins, and we also had to pull out those that having what we would call implausible food intakes. So whether they've reported something that's physically impossible to eat, whether it's double or triple what would be a normal food intake for the day, or an extremely small intake of food for the day. And that does happen quite a lot in nutrition information, because lots of us don't want to tell a dietitian how badly we're eating or how, whether we're not eating enough. So that happens quite a lot. The mean age of the women are 25, and gestation of these women for when we've done these surveys is about 35 weeks. 70% of them have high school education or less, so I would put that as education at around 15 years of age is when they tend to leave school. So as I said, 61% are overweight or obese, and unemployment of the group is high. When we look at the food groups, so you can see there's the food groups: breads and cereals, fruit, vegetables, dairy. The serving recommendations is in the second column, and then our cohort serving intake is next. You can see that one of the areas where we're most likely to be meeting the recommendations are in fruit, vegetables and dairy. However, it's quite poor for breads and cereals and meat and alternatives. The other one is extras, and I wanted to point this one out. So extras is what we would call junk food: burgers, milkshakes, sugary drinks. So you're supposed to only be having between 0 and 2.5 servings a day, and our cohort is having about 6 a day, which is certainly going to be leading to a lot of the obesity that we're seeing in the group. When we broke this down further to the micronutrients, and particularly the ones that are important for pregnancy, I guess were the ones we were really interested in, we found that only 2% were meeting the iron levels that they needed to during pregnancy, which is obviously has significant level issues related to hemoglobin, immunity, iron deficiency, anemia, which is fairly high in pregnancy anyway, but it certainly would be excessive in this cohort, we believe. 38% didn't meet their fibre content, which has big issues in terms of obviously constipation, which is going to deal with their own physical comfort, but it has a significant role in lowering blood pressure and decreasing the risk of preeclampsia. And we do know that we have issues with hypertensive disorders in pregnancy in this group. However, 100% of them exceeded the maximum recommendation for sodium intake, which is probably very related to the discretionary food, and also the excess related to saturated fats. We've recently published a systematic review looking at what are the impacts of this kind of maternal nutrition on offspring kidney function, because that's obviously a very important question for this group of women. And what we found is that changes to kidney structure are influenced by micronutrients of vitamin A, folate concentration and vitamin D, which we know that our cohort is not really meeting the guidelines for these things. Changes to kidney structure is also affected by micronutrients, particularly folate, B12, protein, vitamin D, iron, and reduced nutritional intake. When we look at some of the famine cohorts, we certainly see that there's changes to the kidney function that come through.
Can I ask you another question?
Yeah, ask away.
Why is there a problem with vitamin D?
I don't know. It's one of those questions.
Is it a sunny climate?
Yeah, it is a sunny climate.
We actually have really high rates of vitamin D
Deficiency.
deficiency in Australia. I don't know in the Indigenous cohorts, but in other
Yeah,
non-Indigenous Australians, it's because people wear so much sun cream,
yeah.
and we don't go out in the sun because it's too hot and you will get sunburned. So there's actually,
But
quite high
they're
rates of
dark
vitamin
skinned,
D
they wouldn't
deficiency.
need to do
Yeah,
that.
so I'm not
They
sure.
do, they still do. They still get sunburnt. They still get skin cancers. They still get melanomas. So they still do need to use sun protection. Yeah, and it does get just too hot.
I just don't go outside.
For a very large percentage of the year, we just don't go outside. So we looked at some of our fetal ultrasounds of the kidney developments, and what we've shown is that, I'm sorry, I tried to make the lines stand out a bit more, but I probably haven't done it as neatly as I could have. But the top line is actually the trajectory of growth of what we see of the male fetuses and their kidney development, and the lower one is the females. So we can see there's certainly differences in the trajectory of growth for the females and males infants. And we certainly know that we had a reduced kidney volume. Kirsty, correct me if I say this incorrectly. Reduced kidney volume in women who had infants who smoked. However, they actually were proportionally smaller as well because they had a lower birth weight due to smoking. I've said that correctly,
They're
am I?
mums who smoke, not the infants who smoke.
Yeah, sorry, the mums who smoked, not the infants who smoked, of course. So we do know that there's certainly a risk. There's certainly some things showing that there's going to be some risk for kidney function. The pregnancy outcomes for our cohort are really interesting to have a look at. So only 43% of the cohort have what you'll consider an absolutely healthy, normal pregnancy. We have high rates of pre-existing diabetes and hypertension, high rates of small for gestational age, high rates of large for gestational age, high rates of gestational diabetes, preeclampsia and hypertension, and we also see high rates of proteinuria and albuminuria in the women during pregnancy, which some of these things are related to obesity, as you would know, but some of them are very definitely unusual findings, and you wouldn't certainly expect women who are in their 20s to be having high rates of proteinuria and albuminuria, and that's certainly a concern. So we tend to follow our mums and bubs up at different times. So in the first 12 months, we see them 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, and then we go on and see them annually after that. And as I said, we're trying to increase that up to, increasing that up to 10 years of age now. I wanted to actually, I show this photo all the time because it's my favourite. I love Hayla, the baby, but Hayla's grown up now. And I wanted to also highlight Jodie, her mum. So you can see, obviously, Hayla's just the cutest munchkin in the world. But Jodie, her mum, is quite a big, overweight woman. And since that time, Hayla has now reached 4 years of age. And just recently, we were really excited to use Jodie and Hayla as part of one of the ads for the University of Newcastle to promote the work that we do for Indigenous Australians. And you can see since that time, Jodie's lost a significant amount of weight, and Hayla and Zane, the two kids, are looking really healthy size for their age, and Dad, Gav, is looking pretty good too. So we're really excited that having that, because every time we see those mums, we have an opportunity to intervene, and it may not be a long intervention, but it's like, how are you going with your weight? Do you want to spend some time with a dietitian? Here we have a clinical dietitian, because every one of those follow-up visits is done with a clinical dietitian. Yep.
I just have a question about that then.
Yep.
So like if you're intervening, wouldn't that affect the results like relative to the rest of the population?
Yeah, potentially, but I feel that there's a moral obligation to intervene to improve
Right.
health.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So primarily it's observational, because most of the mums will say no.
Right.
There's very few that say yes, but Jodie was certainly one that did, and she's done quite a bit. What we found with the BMI following our infants through from early childhood is that by 1 to 3 years, the preterm infants is significantly higher in our pretermers. At 2 years of age, we see 8% of our children are underweight, and 16% are overweight or obese at 2 years of age. And this is across the whole cohort. By 3 years of age, we have no underweight children. However, by 3 years, we're seeing 30% of our kids are now overweight or obese, which is a significant concern in terms of developing either any kind of chronic disease later on in life. So what are our infants eating when they're, once they're born? What happens? We see relatively good rates of initiation of breastfeeding, but the breastfeeding duration isn't all that long. So in the future, we'll be developing interventions to work with the mums to try and extend that, because we know that accessibility to Indigenous lactation consultants and support is fairly low in communities. So it would be great if we can develop things that add to that and increase that. Introduction to solids for infants is happening at an age-appropriate time. The thing I guess we're really concerned about though is sweetened drinks. Sweetened drinks shouldn't be introduced to any child until over 12 months of age. And we can see in this table that we have at least 8% of our infants are having juice introduced within the first 3 months of life. And by the time we get up to over 12 months of age, each child is having, 63% are having a sweetened drink in the last 24 hours, as well as 96% are having a juice as well. And those kind of sweetened drinks are very definitely going to have a significant impact on the obesity rates of the children. There's lots of things we still need to do in this cohort, particularly looking at the nutritional impact on the kidney development itself, impact of maternal obesity on the fetal kidney, and looking at timely interventions, effective interventions around healthy weight gain in pregnancy. And that's all still to come. But obviously healthy literacy programs around reduction of sweetened drink intake is really important. So I'm going to shift again now to mental health, because I know this is something you guys are really interested in stress. So this is using national data. So Indigenous Australians are twice as likely to report high or very high rates of psychological distress, and it's similar rates for men and women, and it can be in some geographical regions, it can be as high as 71% reporting high rates of psychological distress. 27% show high to very high levels of psychological distress through the NAPSIS. That's the standard across the country. And in the categories of highest distress, we tend to see women represented much more highly than men.
What's psychological distress?
It's, I guess, the combination of your K10, Kessler 10. So it's psychological distress is both depression and anxiety without differentiating between the two. So in pregnancy, we've done a number of mental health measures with the women. We've done the Kessler 10, which is a measure of psychological distress, and we've also done the life event scale and the impact of life event scale. So this is some data from the life event scale. So it looks at, in the last 30 days, have the women been exposed to a particular event? And there's 16 things on the list, but these are the ones that are scored the most highly. You can see that death in the family is certainly extremely high. Within the last 30 days, 49% of the cohort experiencing a death of a family member. Overcrowding at home. I should say, while I'm talking about family members, the Indigenous definition of a family member is probably quite different to what us as Westerners would say. Certainly for me, I know that my cousins, my first cousins I might see relatively regularly, but my second and third cousins, I may not see them for 10 to 20 years, and I really don't know very much about them. But in Indigenous culture in Australia, you can be a fifth removed cousin or a step cousin or a step cousin, and they actually have all equal weighting. So the death of a family member, therefore family members are extremely large and extremely well connected. The death of a family member, obviously that happens more often, and the population dies much younger, significantly younger ages. So this is a huge issue. Loretta, who works for me, last year had 18 funerals she had to attend, and it's very much, sorry business is very much the entire family must attend. There's just no question about whether you can or can't attend. Going to work is not an excuse. There is a very strong cultural obligation to attend those funerals. And you may have to travel huge distances to do that, but it's very important that they do. So as you can see, some of these issues are fairly huge for people to deal with in their pregnancy. I will also say about this life event scale, it doesn't define a couple of things. So mental illness is just something that they tick, but it doesn't define whether this is their own personal mental illness or it's mental illness of a family member or friend. Same with trouble with police, unable to get a job. It doesn't quite define it very well as to whether it's affecting they themselves or others in their family group. When we look at our stress data, which is using the impact of event scale, there's two ways that the impact of event scale can be scored, and this is for PTSD. So the original impact of event scale, actually there should be another thing that pops up there. The impact of event scale is in the third column along, you can see, and you can see roughly the mean score of our cohort at each different trimester of pregnancy. I don't know how representative trimester 3 is, because you can see the number of participants in that sample is quite small compared to the others. However, you can certainly see that it's around 10, and when you look at a large pregnancy cohort out of Norway, their mean score was 6.7, so it's certainly indicating that there's a significant level of stress. When we look at the revised impact score, the reason I've included this is because of another study. So there's another study that used that score with victims of terrorism, and the mean score with victims of terrorism was 20, and we're seeing that in our cohort we sit at around 30, which is showing that the clinical level of PTSD symptoms is very high in the group. So, sorry, this is quite messy, I've just made it a bit easier for you. So the Kessler 10, this is, it assesses for depression and anxiety but doesn't define between the two, it just calls it a general stress marker. And you can see from our cohort we've got roughly 32% of the cohort that have what you would consider likely to be moderate to severe effects of stress from them. The impact of revised stress is the same. We see roughly 32.4% of our cohort showing PTSD clinical symptoms. So I guess the interesting thing for you guys is also, I know Galinda was wanting to know how we're addressing this, and some of this is very early days, but this is, I guess, some of the things that we do. We have a community arts health program, and this is some of our team. Up the top on this side is Arnie Shirley, and on the other side is Arnie Pearl, Loretta, who you've seen already, and Lenice, our executive officer, and myself. This is one of the few nice photos of us. Mostly we're in our art gear and covered in paint, so it's nice to actually have a nice one to show up occasionally. When we did our community consultation, the elders in the community said they wanted us to be giving something back to the community right from the start, and they felt that they wanted something that allowed for culture and that allowed for creative expression and was strengths-based. So they had very strong ideas of what they wanted, and they wanted it to have health effects as well. So we basically what we have to do is increase health education across the community, and I've got in there in brackets PM and C. So we are actually funded by the Prime Minister and Cabinet to do the work that we do, and the Prime Minister's brief that we've been given is we have to increase health education across community, and that has to be from primary school age up. And so we're doing that in lots of different ways. So we have a strengths-based approach, and we also have an Indigenous governance, and initially that was just for the arts program, but that now has shifted across and embodies across both our research work and our arts health. I report to the steering committee every 3 months, and we had our steering committee meeting the week before I came, and it was an extremely long meeting, but it's fantastic. The group of women that are involved in that are wonderful. So we have all Indigenous women, so from participant age in our cohort, so that's from mother's participant age. So our youngest steering committee member is 17, right through to elders, which they make a wonderful contribution and teach me so much all the time. So our arts program, we start with small activities because everybody's a bit daunted when you hand them a paintbrush and go, okay, off you go. So we start with a small activity, and one of the things in traditional times that Indigenous people used to leave at the edge of their territory would be called message stones. And the message stones would be sat down in a particular pattern, and it would indicate whether it was okay for you to travel from one country to the next, And whether there was a corroboree on, whether they wanted to get together, whether it was only women's business that was happening or men's business. So we've I guess taken that, because they used to often be carved or laid on the ground. So we're teaching the community the symbols and painting those onto stones, and those stones are just gorgeous and vibrant. But it's not too scary and a task to start if you're trying to build art skills with somebody. We also work really closely with the university. So we are part of the university, but where we are, we're part of the Faculty of Health and Medicine, and we have university students come up and they have to do a rural health placement as part of what they do. So sometimes they come up and we go, okay, mums have said they want a cookbook, so this is what this was. So we had some dietitians that came up, they stayed for 6 weeks, and they developed a cookbook with the mums. So throughout that cookbook is stories, cultural artworks, and the mums work directly with the dietitians, young dietitians, to say what nutritional things they would like in their cookbook. The ideas of what I might like to cook are very, very different from what the mums might like to cook, and so they work together in partnership to develop this. And this was great not only for the mums, because they've now got this wonderful resource that's been shared across the community, but also for the students themselves. Many of these students will go out and be on clinical practice where they have to work closely with Indigenous Australians, and they may not have ever been exposed to Indigenous Australians if they've been grown up in a metropolitan location. So it's really good because it gives them that cultural knowledge that they need to become really, really good clinicians and practitioners for these communities. So we love having the students come. We just, they're fantastic. So some of our artworks are really interesting, and it's interesting to work with, I guess, how far our mums develop. This is Miranda, and I wanted to show Miranda for a couple of reasons. She was a fairly young mum, so Miranda started her first pregnancy. This was her first pregnancy at 15 and a half. And her little baby Giselle, that you can see there, was one of the first babies in our cohort, which is really nice as well. So she's done both our arts health program as well as being part of our research cohort. Miranda did a belly cast, and we have lots of women doing belly casts, and we're quite famous for belly casts. But so Miranda did that. She really wanted a belly cast. She wouldn't have her bust included in the belly cast. There was too much shame for that for her. And she was really terrified about painting. She just didn't know how that was going to go. However, her artwork there, which is a representation of pregnancy, you can see and it's quite beautiful. It's and quite large artwork. It actually it was one of the very first artworks that the Gomeroi program sold, and it sold at its very first exhibition. So, and for her, that was amazing. A young mum to generate an income that she wasn't anticipating, doing something that she didn't think she could do, is really wonderful. When we're working to sell artworks for the mums, 90% of the proceeds go back to the mums. The steering committee and the mums themselves decided that 10% had to be retained by our program to help support the arts programs that we do, so we can deliver more and more. So that's a really nice thing. This is one of our exhibitions that we had early this year, called Connections, Culture and the Unborn, and it was an exhibition of our bellies primarily, so I don't know how well you can see them there, but we have lots of them there. You go into our art studio, which is much bigger than this room, but there's just shelves of bellies, either painted or in stages of painting, and all different shapes and sizes, which we're very, very well known for. That's a bit closer a picture as well. So you can see some of the artworks that are also on the wall in there. Those artworks were a commissioned piece. There were 3 of them that were commissioned by the local hospital, and they've since been created into vinyls that are on the hospital, and they're in the emergency department. In particular, the goanna, he is now 6 foot by 6 foot square, so he's quite huge in the emergency department, and he's very important in our community because the goanna is the local totem, so it's really important to have him within the hospital, so women anybody, any Indigenous person coming through the emergency department will now see those kind of artworks when they come in. Our bellies are in the clinics of the hospital, which is quite incredible. Like, we just love having them in the clinics, and the mums certainly love them too. So we often get calls from mums who aren't in our studies who want to actually have a belly. These are some of the artworks. They're often really, really vibrant and they're telling amazing stories. This is one that's been done by one of our staff, and it's about the where the two rivers meet and some of the fishing times that she's had there. This one is another one by one of our mums, and she's had lots of issues with mental health, and she said this is how she feels when she's suffering. This is what she feels like inside, this is how it looks, and but she just hopes that the ancestors, which are the rings of white dots, that the ancestors are continuing to support her as she goes through that. This, of course, is the goanna, you can see, and this was a commission to go into the podiatry clinic, which you can see the little feet and hands on there. It's the perfect piece to go in a podiatry clinic with the feet docked up. And this one is all about being on country and connecting. Each of the rings are related to communities, so this is bringing all of the communities together on country. One of our most recent projects that we've done related to mental health that we've absolutely loved, and we're going to do a lot more of this. We did this just as a trial, was working with possum skins. You can see some of the elders and women of the community with their possum skin draped over their shoulder. And at the bottom you can see the painted versions of what that looked like. What the women did, they engaged in a 12-week program where they actually had to look at their life story, major events that upset them, minor events that changed who they are, and they then had to represent it as a painting. So they worked on the paintings on just a standard canvas for about 12 weeks, and then they were shown how to use the traditional actions to put them onto the possum skins. It's really interesting. In Australia we have possums everywhere, but you're not allowed to use possums, so we actually have to import our possums from New Zealand, so it actually becomes a bit of an expensive exercise to do. But in our region it's very, very traditional for women to create possum skin clothing, and so the women, just particularly the younger women, just absolutely loved doing this project, and we're about to start doing it with the high school students in the next little while.
Those hides?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know what a possum is. Yeah, you guys have possums here? Yeah. So some of the other things that we've done around mental health and using the arts has been related to dolls, and this is the exhibition that will be coming to Canada. We've used, we've been very, very privileged to actually work with a number of doll makers. So we've had an exhibition that just opened the night before I flew over here, and we actually have done this with 3 different Indigenous nations. So we've worked with the Six Nations Reservation from Ontario, the Siyazama project from KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and then the Gomeroi project itself. Each of these doll making projects have had, I guess, they've all had Indigenous culture rippling through them, and they've all had personal stories. And I guess the thing that I think has been most overwhelming for all of us when we're standing there looking at the stories of these dolls has been the resilience of the cultures. Despite being suppressed and oppressed for many, many years, these women are continuing to really show strength in their artworks, which has been incredible. The Siyazama dolls here, which you can see, so Siyazama project has been going since the 90s, and that particular group of women, that community, were very, very heavily affected by HIV when HIV started to come into the Zulu region. At that time, Nelson Mandela was the president of South Africa, and talking about sex is prohibited if you're a person of Zulu extract, and Nelson Mandela was a Zulu man. Nelson actually has gone publicly on record many, many, many times telling the Zulu people that no, you don't need to use condoms, you don't need to change your sexual behaviours, you just need a tincture of beetroot will be enough to cleanse the body of HIV, and consequently the spread of HIV from that time was absolutely overwhelming. So the doll making project that started there actually started as literally a women's group trying to generate some tourism dollars by selling dolls. But as they sat around the table with the project officers, they just kept discussing this awful disease and the consequences it was having on them and how it was impacting them. So the Siyazama project is mostly about trying to support women as a community to reduce the impact of HIV. And what these women have done, which I find just incredible, even though they can't themselves talk about sexual practices, they can use dolls to do it. And what they've done in that particular area is they've created these doll tableaus that actually have now gone into the schools, and they actually have reduced markedly the impact and the new cases of HIV in that region, which is incredible to do it through dolls and with the arts. So unfortunately, they've had great losses, and the dolls that you can see here are all related to a doll that they have, for somebody they have lost. So the white dolls represent an angel for them. The dolls here are the dolls from Six Nations Reservation, and I was really privileged to, every time I come to Canada, I go to Six Nations, and I've spent a lot of time with this particular artist, Elizabeth Dockstader, and her dolls are just so incredibly detailed and beautiful. They're only tiny little things, but the level of detail and intricacy in them just blows my mind. And she herself suffered a very severe car accident many years ago and ended up in a wheelchair, and she's quite incapacitated, much more incapacitated than I am, that's for sure. And she said she suffered with mental health issues herself at the time, and found that sitting down and doing the dolls connected her to the old ones, the great ones. And so these dolls actually represent a story related to the coming together of the Six Nations in Six Nations Reservation. So it's really quite incredible, and I was very honoured and privileged that Elizabeth actually let it come to Australia, because it hasn't ever been shown outside of Canada. So to then have it come all the way to Australia is enormous, and so we'll take that one to South Africa as well. But a real privilege for me to be able to showcase that to our communities. And then we have our Gomeroi yarning dolls, which are quite, I guess, whimsical, and they're very rough and ready from some of the skills that you see in the Six Nations and the Siazama dolls. But these dolls have absolutely the most incredibly poignant stories. So this doll here I like to show, and this is a doll representing Nan Nell. Nan Nell was part of the Stolen Generation, and she always wore her pink lipstick and her pearls every day, and she's now passed away. And her children made this doll because they wanted to show her that they were thinking of her, and they knew the pain that she'd suffered. And her children were devastated when at her funeral they talked about her being from the Stolen Generation, and not once had she ever shared that with them in her life. And so they were devastated to lose that experience and to be able to share that burden with their grandmother. So overall, what I want to say is that for us, neither program would be successful without the other. The arts helps us build community connections and trust, and we just get to share the most incredible, beautiful culture with people. But and having that trust allows us to have the community, I guess, engage in something that they may not necessarily want to engage in generally. However, all of them can really see that we are very committed to improving outcomes for them. And so I guess that's the primary thing, is that if you're going to do a project with Indigenous communities, you have to show that you're willing to take on culture, take it on board, and utilise it in your everyday practice. And so any of the interventions that we develop from here will certainly embrace culture in any way that we can, whether it's with the arts itself, whether it's with stories, Dreamtime stories, we don't know yet, but the community will be very heavily involved in what we design, which is great. So I want to just thank the investigators of the Gomeroi Guinegul team. So we've got a huge list of investigators, and I'm very lucky to have Dr. Kirsty Pringle has come over here as well. She was in the States, and when I said we were coming up to Canada, she whizzed up with me, which is great, and Sam, one of her PhD students, is here. So this is obviously work that's been a collaboration from all of those and our funding bodies. And if you'd like to follow us, we have a Gomeroi Guinegul Facebook page. We have there's something that goes up on Facebook almost every day, and that's related to either health information, health education, what's happening in the studio, what exhibition we're doing, all kinds of different things. And then there's obviously our Twitter handles as well. So thank you very much.